Now, today in the shop, I wanted to do a test of the Tolecut dry sandpaper. It's dry rather than wet, and it's different technology, and I have never used it before. Many of my friends have told me about it. John Pothier was gracious enough to send me a sample of it that he got from Amazon. You can get the same sample from Amazon for about $17. And when I did the little test today, I thought, wow, I'm going to be using this in the future at some point in time. I can already picture a lot of places I can use it. And I showed this for two different types of finishes today. Now today in the mail, I got my sample for a dry sanding system from, I hope I'm saying this word right, Tolecut. It's some samples of their dry sanding system. Now, I'm a perfect person to test this because I've never sanded dry in my 60 years of painting. I'm going to give it a shot today. John Pothier had this sent to my house. He, of course, has restored one of the most beautiful Corvettes in California, and he knows a lot about paint, a lot about modeling, and dry sandpaper. So we're going to try this. I'm going to try to compare it to the wet and dry system, buff the parts out, and you decide. Now, I've done all the paint work on all of the motorcycles in my collection. And this is going to give me an opportunity to see some old paint, some new paint, and some factory paint, and do what I think will be a pretty valid test. And this is the sample pack you get for 17 bucks. So this is what John sent me, and thank you, John. It's a sanding system for dry sanding, 3 different grits, and a little block. It's a hard rubber block, similar to what a polywog would be. But this is specifically made for dry sanding. Now, it looks like they make a full array of sanding systems, various papers, and this is the kind of thing, if you're like I am, you want to experiment with some different technology. Now, for me, dry sanding is a whole new technology. Now, I typically, because I'm painting motorcycles, model airplanes, and smaller parts with a lot of curves and edges, a tool like this wouldn't be a total value, although it might help. But one of the things I like to do is everything by hand. And I like to control everything by hand and then do the buffing with the Harbor Freight buffer. Okay, I wanted to put the information here. And obviously you can look up their website, but it's Eagle Abrasives. So basically this is what you get. It's about 17 bucks from Amazon. And of course, 3,000 grit paper. 2,000 grit is what I typically use. And the 1,500, which you would use if you had a lot of nubs in a paint or imperfections. But we have some factory paint, and I'm just going to give this a shot and just get a rough idea of how this is going to work out. Now, before I test any product for any even just for my own information, or in the case when I tested Flitz, any product I start with, any paint, any product like this, I want to start with a clean surface. The reason is anybody that's a professional painter will tell you the first thing is you never want to sand something that has wax or silicone on it. You just drive that down into the grooves and then you potentially wind up with fish eyes. So we have, this is ordinary simple green. We start with a clean. This is a factory finish. That's probably, I'm just going to guess it's 20 years old, 15, 20 years old. It's factory paint. So this will give us a little idea of how this product would work on a factory finish. Now this is just ordinary factory paint. And again, I wanted to make just a fair test of how the sanding would go on older paint. Newer paint I'm going to do later in the video, but I know this paint is about 20 years old, somewhere near there. And then I have some paint that's maybe 5 or 6 years old, so I can kind of get a feel for if it's going to be the same. Sometimes newer paint tends to gum up the sandpaper. I guess we're going to find out. But we're trying this first with dry sanding. Now the sticky back paper comes in little postage size squares. It's already cut, and you peel one off, put it on one side of the rubber block, and you're pretty much ready to go. Now this sandpaper, John has told me it lasts very long, and you just keep wiping the dust away. We're going to see right away. Now, if you watch the internet, you watch people painting cars, they usually show you how they buff the hood or a door. Big flat surface with a power buffer, a power sander, and this material. I'm going to try to show how you would do little detail work. This is the sandpaper is now glued to the little rubber block. It's 2000. Since this is factory paint, this will be a good test of what would typically happen with any motorcycle part that has a lot of curves, a lot of edges, a lot of angles, and this is typically what I deal with on my channel. I don't deal with the hoods of cars and things like that, but this is going to give us a real test, and this block is just about the right size. If I were to design it, this is about the size I would use. Now, myself, I use hardwood blocks. I have a bunch of them, but this is definitely going to work well. So on my channel, I always try to show the first step of any process like this in real time. No fast forwarding or anything to make the video a little bit shorter or easier to watch. Might be a little boring, but this is the part that I thought was really significant. That the block is very, very easy and comfortable on the fingers. I think if it was bigger or smaller, might not be. This was very comfortable to use. This surface has a very gradual curve. It's not totally flat, much like what you would do in a hood of a car or a door. And I don't want to deal with doing any exotic stuff now. I just want to get a gut feel for how this works. Now, the idea is you just take a microfiber and take the sanding dust off. And the sandpaper, I was amazed. I thought right now, if we were using ordinary sandpaper, right about now the sandpaper gets clogged up. But this, you just wipe it with the microfiber and it seems to just, the dust goes away. Now on the big power sanders, they hook a vacuum hose. We don't need to do that for a job like this. But it's this is where I think the saving is on this product, is that you can get in all little details, little edges, angles, finding little defects in the paint. And where when it's a wet sanding job, it gets a lot more cumbersome to do it. Okay, so I have this part flat sanded, and that went in real time. That went very, very quickly. You can see the shiny spot and the dull spot. Now it's time, and you could pick the polish of your choice. 4CR 8065, one of the polishes I really like, and just do a typical buffing job. Now everybody's got their favorite polish and their favorite polishers. This is the Harbor Freight one. The reason I like it is on smaller parts with a lot of curves and angles and edges. You can control it. It takes a little bit longer than if you used a big heavy-duty car buffer. But I think overall, when you're all done, the extra time you spend is well invested. Now, I could see right away, and I always use 2000. Some people use, you can use 1500 or 2500 according to your shop conditions, the paint you're painting. But a good starting point, if you're new to this, would be do what I just did, 2000 grit. Put a new pad on the buffer, use the polish of your choice. I wanted to show this in real time, not fast forward. So you get an idea of how long it takes for that little area, that little square to come up. And obviously just to figure out how long it would take to buff out a gas tank, multiply that times, I don't know how many squares there would be, you could figure it out. But this is the kind of work, when you start wet sanding and buffing, the wet sanding gets really sloppy. You've got to do a lot of wiping and use up a lot of paper towels. So I can envision that this could be a real time saver on a lot of different applications. It seemed like that buffed out pretty much the way it would buff out with the dry or wet sandpaper, either one. And of course, no matter what you do, it's going to be better than the factory finish. The final finish on this was, you could see a mile away, was a nicer. There's no ripples, no orange peel, no defects. And the next thing I wanted to try was wet sandpaper, the same grit. Now, I've got over 60 years of experience of wet sanding things. Using soapy water would be the most obvious choice. Warm soapy water, a little bit nicer, a little bit better, I think. And sometimes if I know there might be a chance of contaminating on an older part that just came into the shop, I'll put a couple of sprays of simple green into the sanding water. In the past, on model airplanes, when you're sanding butyrate dope, I've sanded with M600 instead of water. Problem with that is you get a lot of fumes in the shop. You pretty much have to do it outdoors. I've used other degreasing agents like Prepsol, and there's every technique in the world. Every person that paints for any length of time develops his own little tricks, own little shortcuts. I can only show you mine. But look on the internet at some of the people that are buffing out car doors and hoods, and boy, when they have those power tools, it looks like they can do a whole car in a very short amount of time. But these kind of parts, where the parts have angles and edges and you've got to be careful not to go through in spots, it's a whole different animal to buff smaller parts rather than the hood of a car where it's all flat. Now, I didn't try to do a time by the minute, but it seemed like very close amount of time and effort was required to make the paint come to a full buff finish with no scratches. And anybody that's buffing knows that from time to time you get paint that just doesn't want to come up, and some paint just comes up in a matter of a minute or two, but you never know. And it's the mysteries of life to me. But anyway, if you're using controlled conditions, a body shop, heat lamps, it's a whole different thing. But when you're a hobbyist working in your cellar, or you're doing this part-time or for the first time, well, there's always some surprises. But that's the purpose of my channel, is because most of the subscribers are people like myself working out of their own house or their own shop, and they'd like to pick up some good useful tips. Well, today you can pick up one of them. This dry sanding thing looks like it's going to have a future in my shop. I'm going to definitely try some different things in the future. I'm in the middle of working on several big projects right now, and I'm really curious to find some areas that this would really be useful to have. I can picture them, and I can picture, even because I do have a power sander, I can picture some areas like a fairing where I could use this to do it like it's the hood of a car. But again, we're going to find out in the future. This was test day one, and test day one went just about as good as I could ever expect on this 20-year-old paint. That is, right now, if you went to a car show, a bike show, something like that, you would be right up there with the people that have the nicest finishes in the show. Now, I'm not really sure when you look at this on a video, unless you're watching on a big screen TV, that you can see. Now, I've taken off all the tape because I wanted to hold this up to the light. I wanted to see where the factory finish has a very vague orange peely look. That's very typical of, well, of factory finishes. And certainly nothing wrong with that, but I can see right here, I've got some real nice areas, and I can see right there. And I'm not sure that you can see that on you're not going to see it on a telephone. There's some orange peely, how ripply it is, but see, right, as soon as you get to the buffed area, you go from ripply, like water waves, little waves, to where it's dead flat. And that's the beauty of that rubber block. It does a great job. So I have one of the spare bodywork parts for my 750 Ninja. This paint is about 7 years old, and I wanted to just use it as an experimental piece. I'm going to be doing this on different things too in the future, because I want to try it on a lot of different surfaces. This I thought would be good because it's not 20 years old, it's 7 years old. And then I still have to try it on some brand new paint at some point next time I paint something in the shop. But here's just a good example of something. When you want to try to test something, this is the way I test it anyway. The tape keeps it that you can at least see the area right next to, I'll make a little bit bigger spot there, in fact. What I really wanted to see is if this sandpaper is going to be, now this is a curved surface. So sometimes, if I can get in the corners with that block, that rubber block is really, really a handy little tool to have. And I do have a bunch of other shaped hard rubber polywogs of similar shapes. I have bigger ones and little ones, and this one seems to be the most convenient one I've got so far. And I think it's going to be permanently part of the shop from today on. But there's always room to experiment with new stuff. I never get tired of trying new stuff. And this really is the first day I ever did dry sanding. In the past, when I've dry sanded with 2000 grit paper, I've tried it. I've wound up throwing so much of the paper away I said, this is just crazy. And you just use the water, you can get 10 times the life out of the sandpaper. But that sandpaper is made to be used wet or dry. This is not made to be used wet. Now, I don't know. I'm going to do a little check and I'm going to try to get some information. I wonder if you use this sandpaper wet, what the difference would be. I didn't see anything on it that said wet or dry. But anyway, it's always good to experiment. This was a wonderful day to do this. And I've really gotten in my mind now that this is something I want to have in my arsenal of stuff. At some point in the future, we're going to be doing the Moto Guzzi Daytona restoration, and there is tons of body work, and there's 2 seats to that bike, and there's so many parts. Anything I can do to make it easier, quicker, it's going to be in my favor. And I think the next time I get to test things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to order some of this material. First, I'll see if they have it at Gavin's, and if I can get some at Gavin's, some tests, one of each, I can do some power sanding next time I do a fairing and see if it's really a time saver. I think it will be. I have a good feeling from the testing of this that this is a product, again, that I'll want to use. Now, it doesn't mean wet sanding is now obsolete. What it means is have it both ways and see what works best in your shop or under your conditions. Now, I also had a thing in my mind I wanted to try. I'd like to try out on my 14-year-old minivan. The paint is getting a little shabby after all these years. I wanted to spend a day buffing it out when I got a spare day. Well, it seems like that spare day never comes. But one of these days I'm going to try and see how many hours it takes to actually buff out a full-size minivan. This looked like something we're going to use in the future. And thank you, John. This was a real good way to spend today. I feel like I definitely have learned something. So my overall impression, if you have a totally flat surface or a slight curve, that rubber sanding block is great. Here's a couple of my gut impressions. The dry sanding is a lot more delicate, and you can get in, like in the corners where the tape came together very nicely. Hard to do that with wet sandpaper. But again, the wet sandpaper, I don't know if you factor out. I watched a few videos of other people using similar products on a sanding machine doing a door of a car, and that they say they can do the whole thing with 2 sanding discs. That's amazing. You really can't do that with the other sandpaper anyway. But anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to try this in the future. I'm going to order some of the products so I have some sheets. I want to try this on several parts in the future, and while I'm waiting for the product to come, we're going to go back to using the old wet sanding method. But this opens up the door to a lot of possibilities because it's very delicate. You can get in corners and edges and angles and nice little parts. When it's like this, being the hood of a car, well, I'm not so sure a power sander would do that. Now, another thing if you look at the shine on the final part, that has nothing to do with the sandpaper. That's a factor of the buffing, the 8065. So you don't want to confuse that. But what you would see if you were using a sandpaper that left any scratches or holograms, you would see it in the 8065. You would have to go 2 or 3 times as long. What I think in my little baby test here, I came to the conclusion that basically the time that you take to buff out the sanded surface is probably pretty similar, and the result is pretty similar. Where you save the saving is when you have to do a delicate area, or I'll give you an example, the 1500 when you're taking out paint nibs or runs, there's a lot of possibilities for that. We're going to try to use some of this on our future products, on our future projects, and I know the product's available from several different manufacturers. This looks like it's a good one. This looks like something I'd want to have in my shop for the future. So I hope the information on this video is useful if you're painting, restoring anything, or just want to watch somebody do an honest day's work. And as I said before, the purpose of my channel is to share useful information that we can all enjoy our paint work a little bit more. And this was definitely a little building block that I'll be using somewhere in the future on projects. And I'm very happy, and once again, thank you, John. This is the kind of thing that you don't think is a significant gain until a day comes along and you have either a fairing or a tank or something that you have to do, and then you realize, wow, I just saved about an hour here and an hour there. I think ultimately this is going to be a time saver. I think it's going to be just as good as wet sanding. It's not going to have a different result. 2000 grit paper will have the same amount of scratches to buff out in it, but I think I can do it a lot faster on certain selected small parts. And thanks guys so much for watching. I enjoy editing the videos. Hope you enjoy watching them. Share them with your friends. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.